All right. Last week, what I tried to point out, what we looked at was the fact that many of the doctrines that exist in Christianity, the reason for the abundance of different opinions, different ideas, different doctrines, some of them completely opposite to each other, and yet all based on Christian, supposedly Christian teachings, supposedly based on the Bible. What we saw was that one of the reasons was that people read the Bible in a legalistic way. I've been using that word a lot in recent times, but that's because I've been coming to understand the word more clearly. I'm seeing more and more clearly that legalism is not simply a doctrine of how people are saved. It's an approach to life. It's an attitude to life, to learning, to the things we read, to the things we experience. It's an attitude that views things in a superficial way, that focuses on words and statements instead of trying to understand the meaning and the implication. That's one of the things that I firmly believe is one of the greatest contributors to false doctrine. The other thing, maybe a little bit similar as well, and that is that people get into false doctrine because they don't understand the kind of person God is. And the reason why I said this is also based on legalism is because obviously people don't understand God because they read statements relating to God and they accept those statements on a superficial level. Okay, they hear statements, they read statements, and they form conclusions based on the statements instead of trying to understand more deeply what is really being said. And we used some examples of this last week, where for example, Jesus says that, the Bible says that God loved Jacob and he hated Esau. Obviously, if this is true on a superficial level, God hates people. And yet, those who know God will understand that this is an impossibility. But if you read that statement in a superficial way, in a legalistic way, you will end up not knowing God, not understanding God. And this bias in your mind will color everything you read. You will read with these myopic eyes and with this smear over your face, over your eyes, that when you see things that you know are impossible, God could never do this because of the kind of person he is, you will accept it because you don't know God. So I would say those are the two things that I really believe are most important: understanding the true character of God and learning to read the scriptures on a deeper level, not in a superficial legalistic way. And because of a failure to meet those two criteria, people end up in all kinds of false doctrines. And so today I want to look at one of those false teachings and try to see what the Bible really says on this subject. So the topic I'm going to look at today is what I consider perhaps to be the most awful false doctrine. I'm going to start there. I'm going to start with what I consider the worst one, and then we'll work our way week after week to the others. But I believe the worst false teaching in Christendom is the doctrine of an eternal burning hell. You know, I've said this many times. I've said this time and time again. But I repeat it this afternoon because I really do believe it is the worst teaching. It is a teaching above all others, I believe, that distorts the image of God and paints an ugly picture of the God of the universe. I would say that more people have become skeptics, unbelievers, because of the doctrine of hell more than perhaps any other doctrine, because it paints a picture of God which is very unpleasant. And to be very frank, if there really is such a place as the hell that people believe in, I would find it very difficult not only to serve God, but also not only to appreciate God, but also to serve God. I'd find it very difficult. I would find him to be a very unpleasant and distasteful person. So we're going to start by looking at the doctrine of hell. And let me go ahead by sharing my Bible. So the first point I want to make is that there is an almost universal belief in hell. What I mean is that in most religions, there is some kind of concept of hell, some kind of place of torment. I know Islam believes it. I know the ancient religions of Greece and the Roman religion, they had some concept of some kind of place of punishment. So, it's not something that is limited to Christian thinking. As a matter of fact, I believe it entered Christianity, or Christendom, let me say Christendom, it entered Christendom by way of the adoption of pagan ideas into the Christian faith. Now I'd like to first of all define the doctrine of hell as it is understood in Christendom. Now, maybe I should just put it up on the screen. All right, let me put it on the screen because it's probably better if we read it than if I just state it. We pay a little bit more attention when we read something. Give me a second. All right. How do I do this? Oh. All right. The understanding of hell in Christendom is that it is a state of eternal torment. By means of unquenchable flames, and I'm going to say immortal worms. Okay? So, all of these words I've highlighted, these phrases I've highlighted, because these are the objectionable elements of this doctrine of hell. It is a state of torment, which means a place of suffering. And the suffering takes place by means of flames, fire, that cannot be put out, unquenchable, and by means of worms that cannot die. So the idea is that people in hell are being constantly eaten by worms that apparently are unaffected by the flames, and these worms never die, and the flames never go out, and this is your condition for all eternity. You will never ever cease to be tormented in this way. Now, I'm going to read something from a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Edwards, because I believe this is probably the best expression of hell. When I say the best, this presents hell in its true picture. The teaching of hell is presented here in its true picture. Probably I should also put this up on the screen. Let me see. Probably better if we read it together as well. So let me go back to that. Where are we? Okay. All right, so let me bring this on the screen and we're going to read it together. The name of this man was Jonathan Edwards. And of course, this is a sermon from many years ago. Actually, he lived in the 18th century, 1703 to 1758. Now here is the comment I read about this man on the internet. He's referred to as this great theologian. He began a revival in his Northampton, Massachusetts church in the 1730s that became part of the general revival movement called the Great Awakening. Now this Great Awakening movement is something that is well known in evangelical circles. It is said that in this period there was a great spiritual awakening in America and in different parts of the world, and it's recognized as what we call a great revival. So Jonathan Edwards was a part of that movement. He preached a sermon entitled "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." And the very title itself makes you cringe a little bit. But I'm going to read what he said. I'm going to read his teachings as a part of his sermon. That God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you. What does the word abhor mean? It means he loathes, it means he scorns, possibly even hates you. He abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear you in his sight. You are 10,000 times as abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in our sight. It would be dreadful to suffer this fierceness and wrath of Almighty God one moment, but you must suffer it to all eternity. There will be no end to this exquisite, horrible misery. When you look forward, you shall see along forever a boundless duration before you, which will swallow up your thoughts and amaze your soul, and you will absolutely despair of ever having any deliverance, any end, any mitigation, any rest at all. You will know certainly that you must wear out long ages, millions of ages, in wrestling with this almighty, merciless vengeance. And then, when you have so done, when so many ages have actually been spent by you in this manner, you will know that all is but a dot to what remains, so that your punishment will indeed be infinite. All right, I'm not going to prolong it by continuing to look at this. Now, I don't think you will ever hear another believer in hell preach a sermon that has these elements so clearly outlined. But the truth is that this is what the doctrine of hell teaches, and every person who believes in an eternally burning hell, this is what they believe. They may not say it. Believers in this hell will come on and they will talk about God is a God of love. Look here. Those words are empty words if this is truth, but this is what they actually believe. This doctrine makes, if you are not somebody who has been indoctrinated into the ideas of Christianity, you read something like this and you are appalled, you are flabbergasted, you wonder, how on earth can such a person be a God of love? And to be honest, I didn't become a Christian thinking about this kind of hell. I think I learned early that God was not like this, and that hell, there was no such place as this everlastingly burning fire. But at the same time, I don't know what would have been the consequence if I had come into Christianity with this kind of teaching, because I know I tend to be a person who I try to be real. I try to be honest with myself, and I try to be honest with what I believe. And certainly, I would have come upon a collision with this doctrine if I had been introduced to this as a part of my Christian environment. So this is why it puzzles me that there are so many people who seem to be committed Christians, who make a claim to loving the Lord, who make a claim to who preach that God is a God of love, who claim to be preaching the good news of the love of God, who embrace such a doctrine that I can only declare to be abominable. I mean, that's the best word I could think of using to describe something like this, and yet there are so many people who believe it. So, how does this match up with one of our two criteria? The character of God, and secondly, the way we interpret the Bible. Well, first of all, let's look at the character of God. God says in Ezekiel 33 and verse 11, and I could find dozens of verses like this. I'm just going to select about 3 of them and read. In Ezekiel 33 and verse 11 it says, "Say unto them, As I live, saith the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn ye from your evil ways, for why will you die, O house of Israel?" Here the Lord says, I have no pleasure. I don't desire it. I don't like it. It gives me no happiness to see the wicked die. If he doesn't like to see the wicked die, why would he take pleasure in seeing the wicked burn in hell? Well, to be fair, nobody says that he has pleasure in it, but they say it is his will, and it is his design and his purpose to so design the universe and so design the punishment of the wicked that there will be no end to this torture. Jonathan Edwards described it as this exquisite, did he say torture? I think that's the word he used. Exquisite torture. And, he spoke about how awfully enraged God is. How can you be comfortable in the presence of a person whose character is so contrary to everything that you understand about love and about fair play and about goodness? So he says, I am a God of love, and he roasts his enemies forever. How do you feel around a person like this? Clearly this person exists on a level that I can't understand. Clearly this person's concept of right and wrong, this person's concept of justice is one that I cannot understand. I could never be comfortable with a person like this. And so what you find is that when people embrace something like this, they speak the doctrine and they use the words or the terminology that they should use, but in actual fact, these two ideas cannot exist in the same heart. That I love the God of love, and I believe he is this vindictive person who tortures people forever. Those two ideas cannot coexist in the same heart. And so it turns people into people who say things that they don't really mean. They talk about the love of God, but in actual fact, they don't believe it. Now, if this were the only criterion that I had for judging this doctrine, I would reject it out of hand, because knowing and understanding the God of love, knowing the God that I see in Jesus Christ, knowing the God that we have come to admire and respect and appreciate, this alone would make me reject this doctrine. There's a gentleman that I spoke to about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years, maybe 4 years, but he belonged to He belonged to a certain religious group, not my religious group, and not the group that I used to belong to. But anyway, he belongs to a group that believes in this everlasting burning hell. And I spent some time at his home. And one morning I just said to him, brother, I understand that your church believes in this doctrine of eternal burning hell, but I'm going to ask you something very frankly, and you can give me your answer as your personal answer, one to one. I said, we believe in the God of love. As a matter of fact, I was invited to that church to preach some sermons on the righteousness of Christ, and that's what I was doing. And I said, we believe in the love of God. We believe in the character of the God of mercy and grace. How can you reconcile this with the idea of God roasting his enemies forever and ever and ever without ever ceasing? And he didn't answer me immediately. He stopped and he thought about it for a while, and then he said, to be honest, I can't reconcile it. It doesn't seem possible. I thanked him for his honesty. But that is the conclusion any honest person will come to. And I was grateful for this man's honesty, but it makes the point that I'm trying to make, which is that a lot of people embrace things without thinking of the implications, and this is a form of, I would refer to it as a kind of legalistic reading. You scratch the surface and you take what the words say without understanding the meaning behind the words. And that's typically the definition of legalism as I understand it. In 1 John 4 and verse 8, it says, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. The scripture says this. How can you reconcile that with the idea of a God who roasts people forever? Let me share another one. In Luke 9 and verse 55, you have the case where Jesus was about to go to Jerusalem, and then he was passing through a village of the Samaritans, and the disciples went ahead to make ready for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. It says, and when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? Now, these disciples were not asking for permission to burn these people forever, or for even a few days, or even a few hours. What they were asking for was permission for permission for them to call fire from heaven to consume these enemies of Christ. If God is going to roast people, not for a few moments or days or weeks or months or years, not for millennia, but for billions of years, and that's just the beginning. What is wrong with calling down fire to consume some people who have just disrespected the Son of God? Verse 55 says, but he turned and rebuked them and said, you know not what manner of spirit you are of. The NASB says, you do not know what kind of spirit you are of. You don't know what kind of spirit you have. I mean, they might have answered, if they embrace this doctrine of eternal burning hell, they might have said, it's the Spirit of God. It's the Spirit of God. God will do the same thing. And they did have a little bit of precedence on their side, because they made reference to Elijah, who had actually done this. Elijah actually called down fire from heaven upon some of the enemies of God, who did far less than these Samaritans were doing. But what Jesus says is, you don't know the kind of spirit that is in you. Now, obviously, when Elijah did this, either he had the wrong spirit, or his motives were different from the motives of John and James. This is what we need to consider. Why was it that Elijah was permitted to call down fire from heaven on his enemies? Why was it that he was directed to do so? You see the event, But do you see the heart of Elijah and do you see the heart of God? Do you understand the situation and do you know what is going on in the background? Why is this happening? Is this the heart of God? Is this what God wants? Is this the kind of person God is? If this is so, then James and John were perfectly right in their attitude. But Jesus never even rebuked them for the suggestion, for the action that they were proposing, because he might have said, no, burning them is wrong. I'll call down a flood on them, or you can call down a flood on them, or maybe cause a strong wind to pass through and blow down their houses. He's not concerned about the kind of punishment they are looking for. He's concerned about the kind of spirit, the attitude in them that makes them want to destroy their enemies. And he says, you don't know what kind of spirit you have. Clearly, this is not the Spirit of God. It is not the Spirit of God that does this kind of thing. It's not the Spirit of God that tortures his enemies. I mean, of course we know that one day, those who refuse to accept the gift of life, they will have to die. And of course we know that God will do what has to be done. But he does it because there is no other way. He does not decide to torture them for eternity, to punish them because he's offended and upset because they rejected his salvation. No. It's a matter of purifying the universe, not a matter of torturing his enemies. The desire to kill those, to silence, to punish those who disagree with us is not the Spirit of God. So the point I'm making is that just from this perspective alone, you can see that the doctrine of hell is completely contrary to the character of God. Now I'm going to look at some specific verses, and we will see how these verses have been misrepresented or misunderstood. Because there are some verses, let us admit that there are some verses in the Bible that seem to very graphically, and some would say very clearly, teach the doctrine of eternal burning hell. The verses are there in the Bible. There's no question of it. And this is why we want to apply the principle of not reading the scriptures legalistically. As I pointed out, the Bible says that God hated Esau. That's an impossibility. The Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and then condemned Pharaoh because his heart was hard. That doesn't make sense. The Bible says that Jesus says you are to hate your father and mother or you cannot be his disciple. That can't be what God expects us to do. So, this is what I mean when I say we need to look at the verses and try to understand what they are saying. So the first verse I want to look at, or the first set of verses, is Luke 16, verses 22 and 23. As a matter of fact, let me leave that for the third one. Let me look at another one first. Revelation 20, verses 9 and 10. It talks about what happens at the very end of time. It says in verse 10, Revelation 20, and the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. And of course it says, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So it says that in the lake of fire, the devil, the beast, and the false prophet shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. This is in the lake of fire. So, isn't that a clear teaching that there is to be an eternal burning in a place called the lake of fire? As a matter of fact, this is how hell is often depicted in illustrations. You know, people say that it's a lake of fire where the fire is constantly burning. And one of the things I should mention is that there are multiple videos on YouTube put up by people who claim that they went in a vision or they died and went to hell, and they actually saw this lake of fire, and they can tell you graphic details of what they saw. I have no question at all and no doubt that these people are being deceived by the devil. These visions don't come from God. These experiences don't come from God. These are satanic experiences. I don't apologize for saying that. Not meaning to hurt people, but just to tell the truth. Now, just something I want you to notice here. It says that the beast and the false prophet are thrown into this lake of fire. All right, along with the devil. Along with the devil. And then it says that everybody who is not in the book of life is also cast into this lake of fire. Now, look at what it says a little further up in verse 13. Look at this. And death and hell. No, it's verse 14. Verse 14. And the death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. Now, this is what I mean when I say we should read not legalistically, we should read with understanding. We should read carefully, especially when we come upon a passage that seems so clearly to contradict our understanding of God. Read carefully. Now, what is death? Death is not something you can pick up. It's not something you can hold. It's a state. It's a condition. And what is hell? Hell is the grave, the place where the dead go. It's the grave. And even if you consider hell to be the place, a kind of underworld, look at what it says. These are cast into the lake of fire. If the lake of fire signifies a place of torment, what would this be saying? It was saying that God is going to torture hell, and God is going to torture death forever and ever, which is absolute rubbish. Not even an idiot would believe something so meaningless and so senseless. Clearly, death and hell are not things you can actually pick up and put into a location. So that makes us think a second time, well, what is the lake of fire? It is some place you can put death. It is some place you can put hell, and you can also put the devil there, and you can put the beast and the false prophet, and you can put everybody who is not in the lake, is not in the book of life, into the lake of fire. But death and hell are the definitive elements that tell us what the lake of fire is. If you look at the phrase that follows, it becomes clear. It says, this is the second death. Death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. What is the second death? It is the lake of fire. Death and hell experience the second death. The devil experienced the second death. The beast and the false prophet experienced the second death. And everybody who is not written in the book of life will experience the second death. In other words, the phrase, the lake of fire, is a figurative expression. It does not refer to a literal burning place. It refers to an experience that the lost eventually go through. And that experience is the second death. It is the end of existence. How do we know it is the end of existence? Because that is what it tells us. Death and hell are cast into the lake of fire. What this means is that death ceases to exist. Hell ceases to exist. When it ceases to exist, in this figurative language, it is said to be in the lake of fire. Anything that no longer exists is said to be in the lake of fire. So it's a figurative expression. It's like we have some of these expressions in English. For example, if we say somebody has been sent to Coventry, we don't mean that you actually send him to a place named Coventry. It's a figurative expression, and it means nobody's talking to that person. You can look it up. To be sent to Coventry means that nobody will speak to you. So it talks about Coventry. It talks about being sent to a certain place, but it doesn't mean being sent anywhere at all. It means something completely different. And the book of Revelation especially is full of these kinds of expressions. And this is one of them. The lake of fire has nothing to do with a lake, and it has nothing to do with fire. It simply means that people cease to exist. Now, there is a place further up that suggests that they cease to exist because fire destroys them. So there's no question about this. But the fire that destroys them is not a lake of fire, and it's not a place of eternal burning torment. It tells you a little earlier on, up in the same chapter, that these lost people, along with Satan, it says in verse 9, they went up on the breadth of the earth, and they compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. This is how they cease to exist. Fire devours them, like the fire that destroyed the soldiers when Elijah called down fire from heaven. The fire devours them. It's the end of their existence. It's not the beginning of endless torment. But you find that these statements are in the Bible, and as I said, you have to look at them and try to understand what they mean. Let me look at another one here. Luke 16:22 and 23. This is one of the strong verses or passages which is used to support this doctrine of eternal burning hell. It tells about a man who died, a beggar, and he was taken up to Abraham's bosom. It says in verse 22, Luke 16, and it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Now, the reason why this is such a challenging passage is because these are the words of Jesus himself. And people are fond of saying, if it's in the red letters, I believe it. And again, this is a legalistic attitude to the Bible. The red letters say you must hate your mother and father. Do you believe it? No, you interpret it. You translate that into meaning that makes sense. So don't say red letters. Red letters must also be properly interpreted, because Jesus himself said that he spoke in parables that certain people would not be able to understand, and that only wise people, the initiated, would be able to understand. So it's not enough to say it's red letters. You must understand what you read. You must seek understanding. Now, there are elements in this story that tell us that it has nothing to do with a place called hell and a place called Abraham's bosom. It's a story that is told, a made-up story. What is the point of this story? When you read a story like this, you don't ask, what do the details say? You ask, what is the point of the story? Now, the point of the story, you can get near the end. This man in hell would like somebody to go and tell his brothers about this place of torment. But Abraham says to this man in hell, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rose from the dead. This is the point of the prophecy. Believe the scriptures, because if you don't believe the scriptures, nothing will persuade you. This is the point of the story. And there are many stories like this. I mean, most of you have probably heard the story of a scorpion who asked a frog for a ride to cross a river. The frog refused because he said, as soon as you get in the water, you're going to sting me. The scorpion swore that he wouldn't do it. And so the frog agreed finally. And when they got to the middle of the river, the scorpion stung the frog. And as they both began to sink, the frog says, why did you do this? Now we both will die. And the scorpion said, I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. It's my nature. Now, nobody believes that this is true. Nobody believes that there was actually a frog that was carrying a scorpion who asked him for a ride across the river. Nobody believes that story. The details of the story are unimportant. This is how parables are. The story itself is a lie. The story is fiction. Nothing like this ever happened. And yet you would say the story is true. Because you are looking not at the story, but you are looking at the point of the story. What is the lesson that is being taught here? The lesson is true, so the details are inconsequential. They are irrelevant. They don't mean anything. The point that is being made is that nature is so strong that it will cause people to destroy themselves. It's a story that teaches you the power of nature and the need of dealing with your nature when you are trying to make a change. But a story is told because you will never forget the story, and because you don't forget the story, you don't forget the point. And this is what Jesus was clearly doing here. There are elements in the story that clearly show that it is fiction. For example, it says the beggar died and was carried into Abraham's bosom. If you take this literally, what it means is that everybody who dies goes into Abraham's bosom, which is nonsense. Nobody dies and goes and sits in Abraham's bosom, because it says that the man in hell lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. This would suggest that when people are in hell, they are able to look up into heaven, and people in heaven are able to look down into hell. And one enjoys seeing the other one being tormented, while the torment of the other is to see the bliss of the other group. But it's nonsense. People don't go into Abraham's bosom when they die. Neither would a finger dipped in water and touching the tongue of a person in such a place, neither would such a thing bring any consolation or any relief. But Jesus tells a graphic story, a fictitious story, a story that is based on fictitious ideas, because the lesson is important. For the lesson to be made, he had to find an extreme situation, somebody who is dead coming back, and nobody believes. Why? Because they had Moses and the prophets, they had the Bible, and they didn't believe the Bible. So even the reappearance of a dead person won't convince such people. That's the point he was making. So those are some of the verses that are misunderstood. I'll read another one, and to be honest, the rate I'm going, I may need to do a part 2 to this, but we'll see. Revelation 14 and verse 10 says that those who receive the mark of the beast, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And it promises, for those who receive the mark of the beast, he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Now, initially, when you read this, it seems to be speaking of the same experience that we just read in Revelation chapter 20. Revelation 20, where it talks about them being tormented in the lake of fire. It says, the devil which deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Initially, it seems like Revelation 14 verse 10 is speaking about the same thing, because it says anybody who receives the mark of the beast will be tormented in the presence of the angels and in the presence of the Lamb. But this specific reference to the angels and the Lamb, in actual fact, when you look at the third angel's message, Revelation 14, what it is talking about is not torment in a literal place. It's really a reference that is pointing you back to something that happened on earth thousands of years ago. There was a certain set of people who were tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And these were the people of Sodom. Fire and brimstone came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And it was in the presence of 2 angels and in the presence of Jesus Christ. He was there with the angels. So this specific reference to the presence of the angels and the presence of the Lamb, it actually gives you a clue to tell you, go back and look at what happened back at Sodom. And so it is telling you that as we look at the mark of the beast issue, it is helpful to think about what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah in seeking to understand the mark of the beast issue. Now, let's move on quickly. The second aspect of what people believe is they believe in immortal worms. Jesus also said something to support this. If you have not learned the lesson yet that Jesus is speaking in parables, this might further strengthen that realization. In Mark 9 verses 43 and 44, Jesus says, "And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than having two hands to go into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched." Now let me say first of all that he uses the word hell here. And okay, I'm going to come to the word hell in a moment. Let me continue. I'll come to the word hell shortly. Now, he speaks about, again, the fire that shall not be quenched. And he says, the worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched. There is a verse in Isaiah that says something similar. Isaiah 66 and verse 24, where it talks about, in verse 23, that from one Sabbath to another and from one new moon to another, all flesh will come to worship before me. It says, "And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched. And they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh." Now Jesus was actually quoting from this passage in Isaiah. The worm shall not die, and the fire shall not be quenched. Right here in Mark, he says it. Where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. Now, the word hell here is from a Greek word it's spelled Gehenna, Gehenna. It's a Greek word, Gehenna, and according to Strong's dictionary and according to authorities who understand biblical history, it refers to a place called the Valley of Hinnom. It was a valley outside of Jerusalem, and what we understand historically is that this valley was like a garbage dump. It was a place where there was constantly a fire burning, and where they would throw things. I mean, it was not like the sanitation system we have today in developed countries. They have fire burning. They had a fire burning continuously, and they would throw the bodies of dead animals there. Even, I suppose, dead people might have ended up there at times. Dead people, enemies when they had fighting and war or stuff like that. But anyway, the worms were constantly moving in Gehenna because there was so much garbage and dead things that it was a place, a distasteful place, and it signified a place where the rejected and the cast off would end up. And so Jesus said, if your hand causes you a problem, to cut it off. Do you believe that he really meant that? Do you believe you should take a machete or a hatchet and cut off your hand if you find that you're having problems with your hand? Is this what he's saying? Just like he said, hate your mother, hate your father. He's using graphic language. He's using extreme language because he wants you not to forget the point. He doesn't mean you literally cut off your hand. He means take extreme steps, whatever is necessary to stop you from doing the wrong thing. And trust me, cutting off your hand won't stop you from being a thief. What he's really saying is that whatever changes need to be made in order to ensure that we make it into the kingdom, we should make those changes. We should weigh the relative value of things, and we should choose what is most valuable. And so he said it's better than going into hell, into Gehenna. It's better than being thrown into the rubbish heap than to be cast into a place where only the refuse and what is no good and what is reprobate is thrown. That's where you're going to end up. if you allow your circumstances and your passions and your humanity to overrule and cause you to miss out on what is being offered. So it's not a literal place where there's any literal worms burning. It's again a reference to a particular place, and the imagery they could easily understand back there in Jerusalem or wherever it was that Jesus was preaching. Now I'm finding that really I've spent so much time on some of these things. I'm not going to have the time to actually finish what I'm going to say this evening, so I'm going to have to make it into a part 2. But I'm going to touch on a couple of other verses before I stop. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 19, there's a passage which suggests that when Jesus died, he went into hell. I'm going to read a passage, but first of all, let me skip quickly to Psalm 16 and verse 10. I think I have the wrong reference here. Okay. Psalm 16 and verse 10. In a prophecy of Jesus, it says, "For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption." Now the question is, did Jesus go to hell? The word hell here is a Hebrew word. The word is actually Sheol. Sheol. And what it means, it's a Hebrew word that simply means the place of the dead. It's not a place of burning or torment. These are ideas that have been imposed on the word by later Christians who embraced the doctrine of eternal burning hell. It's simply, the Hebrews understood Sheol to be simply a place where the dead are asleep and where they remain until the resurrection. So they never meant that Jesus went into a place called hell. If you look at this verse, it contains what is called, it's Hebrew poetry, and Hebrew poetry, it's not poetic because the lines rhyme. It's poetic because the phrases are repeated. The style of Hebrew poetry is that you make a statement, then you repeat the statement in a different way. It means the same thing or a similar thing. But the repetition is how you get the poetic rhythm. For example, whither shall I go from thy spirit? And where shall I flee from your presence? Same thing repeated twice. And you can even see it in verse 9. Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoiceth. My flesh also shall rest in hope. It's kind of a repetition of the same thing. The verse that follows. In thy presence is fullness of joy. The same thought repeated. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. So look at the verse in question. Thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Now the word corruption, what does this mean? It means to rot or to decay. So clearly, when it says that Jesus was in hell, it means in the sense that he was in a place where there was danger of rotting or decaying. It doesn't mean some underworld where people are being roasted forever. No. It's a place where you would be corrupt, you'd see corruption, or you would begin to rot away. And the verse says, God would not leave his soul in hell, meaning God would not allow him to experience corruption. He would not be allowed to rot in the grave. So that is what Sheol means. And that is where Jesus went. He never went and preached to anybody in hell. Now the passage in 1 Peter 3 and verse 19, people have interpreted to suggest that Jesus, when he died, went down into hell and preached to dead people. That's an impossibility because the dead are asleep. But here's what the passage says. It does give some leeway for that kind of thinking. It says, "For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit." What this simply says is that Jesus died as a flesh and blood person. But when he was made alive, he became a life-giving spirit. He was brought back to life by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. The same Spirit that brought Jesus to life is the same Spirit by which he went and preached unto the spirits which are now in prison. Which spirits are in prison? Who were preached to by the Spirit of God. The spirits that he's talking about is the spirits, let me read the next verse, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. Back in the days of Noah, the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead was also preaching to those people back in the days of Noah. Jesus was preaching to those people through the same Spirit that raised him from the dead. This is what it is saying. Now when it says, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, these spirits are now in prison. These spirits are now in the prison house of the grave. They are imprisoned until the resurrection. And there is no repentance in the grave, and nobody can accept the gospel in the grave. Preaching to people in the grave, even if they were conscious, would be an exercise in futility based on what the Bible teaches. But it is not saying this. It is saying the people who lived in the days of Noah, the Spirit of God through Christ preached to these people. Where are these people now? They are now in prison. But it was the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead that was preaching to those people back there in the past. This is what the passage says. But I know that if you're a person who believes that hell is a place of conscious existence, then you might interpret it this way. But as you can see, when we look at it with a broader understanding the principle of God's into your hands I commend my spirit. He didn't go by any spirit and preach to anybody in a place named hell. So, one passage cannot be made to overthrow the strong weight of all the rest of Scripture. Now I understand that I've spent a lot of time on some of these verses, and I suppose it's necessary to do this, but I've run out of time and I've not completed the thoughts that I had to share today, so I'm going to have to do a part 2 to this next week. But I hope that in what I've shared, we have been able to at least understand. That's what I'm trying to do, to help us to understand the reasons why these verses don't say what we think they're saying. So I'll complete what I wanted to say this evening next week, and I want to just appreciate all of you for being here with me, for helping to encourage me and to keep this webinar alive by being here week after week.